sermons, and his sermons were very long and tedious. And so one of the members of the congregation thought that he would cure him of this habit. So before the service began, he slipped into the pulpit and he removed one of the pages from the sermon at random. Well, finally the preacher began. And after a while, he reached the point where the page was gone. And Adam said unto Eve, and Adam said unto Eve, there seems to be a leaf missing. You'll get it later if you didn't get it now. And so no one get any bright ideas. Actually, after the first service, went and checked on my sermon to make sure that no one from the first service had been up to any no good. About 8 years ago, when I was pastoring a church in Louisville, Kentucky, I befriended a worship and preaching specialist or guru from the Presbyterian headquarters, national headquarters, which is located in Louisville. And she came to hear me preach a few times. And she gave me some great feedback. I'm not sure it did any good, but it was nice feedback. And because of that experience, I'm probably a little better at judging sermons. Now, not my own sermons, you can't judge that, but other people's sermons. So I thought, well, I'm going to try my hand today at judging Jesus' first recorded sermon that we find in the Gospels. This is the sermon that he delivered to his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. He had done some preaching before in other places, and his reputation had preceded him. But this is the first one where we have a record of the sermon. So if I were what we call a homiletics professor or preaching professor, and I were to have Jesus in my class and he gave this sermon, I would have to give him a good grade. Now, not just because he's Jesus, although I admit I'm a little fearful about giving Jesus a bad grade on his sermon. But here's my analysis of this sermon from Luke chapter 4. And I'm going to give 6 points. The first one I'm going to elaborate a little bit. The other ones are fairly brief. Point number 1. His sermon was short and to the point. Now, what happened was, other than reading from a text out of Isaiah chapter 61, he only added one comment, one sentence, until they provoked him to say a little more. His sermon was so brief, in fact, that I can repeat it here without my sermon becoming too long and tedious because of that. Although it will be too long and tedious, but not because of this. Here's what he read from Isaiah chapter 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach, to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That was it. And so after that, he rolled up the scroll. By the way, that wasn't the sermon part. That was the liturgy part. So he rolled up the scroll. He gave it to the attendant, and he sat down. You see, in that day, it was customary for the preacher to sit down while the audience stood up. And I'm wondering, would you like to start engaging in that tradition? No. So we're going to do it backwards, is what you're saying. You are not very biblical, you know that. I didn't think you would want to do that. So he sits down. It's time to preach. And all eyes are upon him. And he says one thing. He adds one comment to the text he read from Isaiah. He said, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. That was it. They were amazed at first, but they couldn't believe that someone that they had known their whole life, little Jesus bar Joseph, Joseph's son, was here making those kind of comments. Like, wow. You know, it took a moment, I'm sure, for it to dawn on them what he was trying to say. Now, they knew he didn't come out of the blue, really. He had a reputation for being a champion already of the poor, the oppressed, the sick. This reputation had been growing around the countryside. They had heard about these stories, and yet they still had a difficult time believing that Jesus of Nazareth, from their hometown, is the person who is making that claim. Now, he senses their doubt about him, of course, and he acknowledges that no prophet is without honor in his own hometown. That's a very familiar saying that Jesus gave us, and it was true. But then, I guess that sort of riled him up. So he decides to ruffle their feathers just a bit. He opens up a Pandora's box, and if you read on in that Luke chapter 4, you will see where he retells a couple of stories, brief stories, about two of Israel's greatest prophets. In fact, they're probably the first two prophets in Israel's tradition, hundreds of years earlier. Their names were Elijah and Elisha. People often get them mixed up, but Jesus didn't. And in both these stories, he reminds his listeners that through these two prophets, hundreds of years ago, God blessed non-Israelites, namely a starving Sidonian widow and a Syrian leper. Both were non-Israelites. Now, by making this claim and pointing this out to his audience, that God had blessed hundreds of years ago people who were not Israelites, this angered this foreigner despising audience, and so they drove him out of the synagogue and out of the city and tried to throw him off of a cliff. So yeah, it was a pretty successful sermon, I think. If it was a trial sermon, I don't think he would have been elected to be the pastor of that synagogue. So first I want to give Jesus a thumbs up for his sermon being short and to the point, although it was not a point that they appreciated very much. Number two, his sermon was just okay in terms of its creativity and originality. It was just okay. Now, of course, as the new AT&T television commercials have been reminding us, just okay is not okay. Any of you seen these commercials? They're kind of all over the place. I think there are 6 of them. So if you need a surgeon, if you need a tattoo artist, a babysitter, a mechanic, some good sushi, or a good serenade for your lover, just okay is not okay. However, in terms of creativity and originality in Jesus' first sermon in his hometown synagogue, just okay it's okay. No one expects an upstart preacher to hit a home run in terms of creativity and originality. He didn't need to do that, so that was okay. My third point critique is this. Jesus exhibits a good knowledge of Scripture. This is important for a pastor to be able to do this, right? Or anybody preaching. For example, he understands how important the passage from Isaiah chapter 61 is for people who have been waiting for God's Messiah to reveal himself. So that's important. He knew what Scripture reference to use to make that connection, Isaiah 61. And he's also clearly familiar enough with the stories of Elijah and Elisha to be able to tell the difference between the two prophets, similarly named prophets. And so for a poor Galilean from Nazareth, he had a pretty good grasp of their biblical tradition. Number 4, his use of illustrations is spot on. It's spot on. The stories of the Sidonian widow and the Syrian leper, these are very appropriate for the occasion illustrations. But more than that, they are convicting. In other words, he uses them to convict his audience. I'm reminded of the old saying that's been around for a while: comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I did a little research on this, and I discovered that it goes way back to the last turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century. And it was first applied to newspapers. So some famous newspaper guy said, here's what newspapers should be doing in the world. They should be comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. Almost kind of like it had a prophetic task to do. Later on, though, this phrase was applied to God by a famous theologian in the mid to late 20th century. But since then, it is often used in the context of the preaching profession. So it is thought nowadays that the job of a preacher is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And so I apologize if I have done any affliction in the last three years and so forth. Number 5, Jesus knows his audience. The fact that he grew up in Nazareth certainly helped him understand his audience. He knew their likes and their dislikes, their theological tendencies, their messianic expectations, and he also understood their attitude about outsiders. So was he being provocative on purpose by implying that he is the Messiah? And the purpose of the Messiah is to minister to everyone and not just the children of Israel, that is, the Jewish people in his homeland. I think he was being a little provocative here. I mean, that's why they tried to throw him off a cliff, because of that. This leads to my final point that I want to make, my final critique about his sermon. Number 6. He owns it. He owns it. Now, own it is a contemporary slang phrase that means to take responsibility for something that you have done. Whether it's good or bad, you need to own it. Because as you know, sometimes we try to make excuses for things that we have done, or we try to hide what we have done rather than take ownership of our mistakes. We've all done that. I've done it, and so have you. But also there are times when we do something good and positive and helpful, but because we're bashful or shy or too modest, we don't want to tell anybody about it. We don't own it. But then there's always somebody who says, you need to own that. Whether it's good or bad, you need to own that. So the thing that, this is my final analysis, the thing that I appreciate the most about Jesus' sermon in Luke chapter 4 is that he owns it. And obviously, when he says the words, his first sentence after quoting Isaiah 61, when he says, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing, he is owning the words of Isaiah 61. In other words, I'm the guy. It's me. I'm taking full responsibility for what this passage is saying. The promises that are being made here in our biblical tradition. I'm taking ownership of that. I will do those things, he says. And as I said, he owns his word so much that the crowd of his fellow Nazarenes tried to run him out of town and throw him off a cliff. He could have been silent. He could have denied things. He could have backed off a little bit. What he was saying could have toned down his message about God loving everyone and not just his people. But he didn't. He owned it. He went through with it. So this is why I give Jesus overall an A+ for his little mini inaugural sermon. Yeah, it was short and to the point. It was just okay in terms of his creativity and originality. He exhibited a good knowledge of Scripture. His illustrations, they were spot on. And he knew his hometown audience. But more importantly, he owned what he said. And herein lies the lesson that you and I can learn from this story. When we make a mistake, we should own it. That's what integrity is all about, is owning your mistakes. But we should also own it when we do something good. We shouldn't hide our light under a bushel. We don't need to brag about the good things that we do or accomplish, but we shouldn't be shy about it either. We should own it. And so my question for us this morning is, this is your homework. Something to think about for the week. Do we here at Immanuel say or do anything that we need to own? Have we said or done anything that we need to own, good or bad, as a congregation? And is there anything you and I as individuals need to own, good or bad? Do we need to own it? Something to ponder. And by the way, if any of you ever play a practical joke on me, like removing part of my sermon before church begins, you definitely have to own it. You have to own it. Amen.